Okay, so I think you finished the episodes from lecture number 1, so we can dive a little bit deeper into more detailed topics of 3D in general, but of course also with some focus on Cinema 4D. So let's talk a little bit about meshes and what are 3D objects actually made of. The most simple and single entity in any 3D application basically is a point, and a point can have 3 coordinates in space, the x, y, and z coordinate, and these 3 numbers basically define the position of that point in space. You can also refer to the point as a vertex, so whenever you come across the term vertex, it means point. There's some terms like vertex weighting or something like this. So basically vertex is just a point. Now if we have more than one point in space, basically 2 points, we can draw a line between those 2 points and refer to this as the edge or also the line. In most cases it actually is an edge, because as soon as you add even more points to your scene and combine or connect those points together, you see we kind of get a shape here. And this shape is also referred to as a surface, or you probably already heard about polygons. So what we have here is basically our first polygon. Now the polygon can also consist only of 3 points, so that we have something like a triangle, and it can also consist out of 5 points or 6 points or 7 points and so on. A very important concept basically in cinema and in a lot of mesh-based 3D applications is that we always try to keep our polygons four-sided, and we come to this a little bit later on why that is important, but just think of it that as soon as you have a four-sided polygon, it's a very simple polygon, because you have 4 sides, you have opposing sides, you have like the left side, the right side, the bottom side, and the top side. And as soon as you have more edges around your surface, then things can get a bit messy from that perspective. So we like to keep them simple, and a quad is basically one of the most simple forms. Now you could argue that the triangle may be even simpler because it only has 3 edges, but if you imagine a triangle here and you only have 3 edges, then you don't have those kind of opposing edges, and this kind of messes Cinema 4D or 3D applications up a little bit. So yeah, keep it four-sided and your meshes will be more healthy basically. Now talking about meshes, so when do we get a mesh? A mesh is basically as soon as we add even more points and connect even more of those points with edges, and then we basically get a 3D object, and the 3D object, this is what we also then would refer to as a mesh, because it kind of consists of quad-based polygons which look like a mesh, I guess. To wrap that up or to turn that around, we could say or conclude that an object or mesh always consists of multiple surfaces or polygons which are enclosed by edges or lines and which are defined by vertices or by points. So this is basically all the ingredients of our 3D objects in our 3D spaces: points, edges, surfaces, and the object itself. Now, and if you remember last time when we spoke about the different modes we have inside of Cinema 4D, we have the object mode, the surface mode, the edge mode, and the point mode. This is exactly this kind of thing, so that you have all these 3 separate kind of ingredients, and we want to have access to these kind of ingredients to transform or to change the appearance of our objects. Now let's talk a bit about different modeling methods. So in one of the first episodes we talked a little bit about parametric objects, and you could also say that there is some kind of parametric modeling, although it's not real modeling because you just place parametric objects in the scene and stack them together in some way. So it's a bit more like building blocks, but they're there for a reason, and first of all they're simple objects, and we can use them as base objects, and they're simple because we want to transform them later on into more complex things. But for in the beginning of your project, you might want to use these simple objects to either block out the shape of your desired object, or you want to start with this kind of simple object and then add more details to it. There are other modeling methods which we will cover also in this course, but we will kind of tackle that in another lecture. So for example, there's also spline modeling, and spline modeling is basically a way to create more like non-uniform objects or organic shaped objects. And you can think of it that it's a bit like a parametric object, so it's a bit like a base object, but it's something like an advanced version of it. But we'll talk about that later. And then we also have, of course, the polygon modeling. This is where we actually use the different points, edges, and surfaces of those base objects and try to transform them as much as possible, and by that getting the kind of shape we are after. With polygon modeling, you can basically model everything you like. You can do very detailed objects, and there are some more like additions to polygon modeling, which we'll cover in another session, where we have more tools and more like advanced methods to get even more detailed objects. Now, those different methods, they come with, as you can see, more possibilities, but also with a higher degree of difficulty. So the parametric modeling is very simple, but it has very limited possibilities. On the other hand, the polygon modeling takes some time to learn, takes a lot of practice to master, but it gives you a lot of possibilities. And then there are also other modeling techniques, and I only like to cover them briefly here to give you an overview. So for example, there's volume modeling. This is basically, think of Minecraft. You have voxels, and you put those voxels together, and a voxel basically is just a pixel in 3D space, so it's three-dimensional. But in some surprising way, it makes modeling much easier because you can just scrape away a few things from the volume and add other things to the volume, and by that creating the shape you're after. We will cover the volume modeling as well in some other episode. And then there's pointer edge modeling. That's basically just a subset of the polygon modeling approach. And then we have what we use in cinema is like a spline approach to NURBS modeling. NURBS is a very long acronym for non-uniform rational B-splines. We cover that also. And cinema is in most cases, or basically in the usual form, a mesh-based modeling tool. And a difference to that is what you refer to as a CAD or CAD, computer-aided design modeling software, where the software itself is not based on meshes, but rather on NURBS. And you can do a lot of crazy things with this. And if you're into manufacturing or really like designing complex objects like car engines or something like this, then you would do this in a CAD software program and not in Cinema 4D. So Cinema 4D is more like for the visuals, make it look pretty, make simple, nice animations, but it's not that advanced or good actually in modeling things. But you can use it for modeling, and we will learn how to do a few models. And then there's sculpting. This is mostly used for organic shapes like characters, animals, this kind of thing. We can also do sculpting in cinema, but again, it's not the best choice for sculpting. There are other more advanced tools for this, like ZBrush, for example, which you get also if you have the Maxon 1 subscription, actually. And it's a bit more like clay modeling, where you have different tools like knives, brushes, and those kind of things to deform a mesh very naturally, basically. All right, let's have a quick recap on the parametric modeling, just to make sure that you get that. We talked about this in one of the first episodes as well. So the parametric objects are the ones you find behind the blue cube, and you will find a lot of different parametric objects. And every parametric object has different settings and different parameters you can change. And maybe let's have a look at one of the 2 or 3 most important things. So first of all, if we start with a cube here, you see we have usually with the parametric objects something like the size properties, where we can change the size of the object. If you're in the object mode or model mode, you see also those yellow squares or points in your scene, and you can use them as well to change the size of your object. And you can see that whenever I change one of those, the parameters up here will change as well. Now the segments is like the segmentation for your object, and you see nothing will change when I do this, and that's because we have to change the view settings for our viewport here a little bit to see what's going on. And we do this by go to display and then activating the grout shading lines, and by this we'll see the segmentation of our object. So let's have a look at the segments X value here, and I just bump that up to maybe 4, and you see in the X direction we get now 4 segments in our cube, and we can do this in basically every dimension. So this is for the Y, and then we get, for example, 3 segments, and for the Z direction, let's say another 4. So why do we do this? We do this to add details to our object. So for example, if I want to make this editable and change the look of the object, I might want to have a few more details in here. So let's say I want to move the inner square here a little bit to the top like this, or I want to move one part here on the side a little bit to the outside. Whatever you like to do, you need these kind of segmentations. Now, just to see the difference, if I would have started with something like this and I wouldn't have changed the segments, make this editable, and then go in here, you see I miss the kind of details and geometry. Now there are tools to add those details later on, but yeah, basically you can use this to get a bit of a head start and increase the kind of details you're after just from the startup. Then what you can do is separate surfaces. This means as soon as you make this editable, then the different faces will be different surfaces, different objects inside your scene. Might be useful in some cases. And then we have the fillet. The fillet will actually bevel the side of your corners or your edges and will make them round. So you can increase the subdivisions. This is basically the same thing as the segments over here. The amount of like divisions it will add to the corner. So you see if I lower this to 1, we only have like 1 division here, and if I add 2, you see we get like 2 segments over here. And the radius basically defines the amount of radius your corner should get. So you find this in a lot of the parametric objects, the fillet. You can activate it or deactivate it. And let's have another look at another very important object, the cylinder. As you can see, same thing here. We have a few size parameters, the radius, the height, and again we have some settings for the segmentation of our cylinder. We have something new here. This is the orientation. We didn't have that in the cube, but we have this for the cylinder, and this is just to quickly orient your cylinder in a different way in your side of your scene. And then if you have a look at the top tab buttons here, you see we have a few more settings. So depending on which kind of parametric object you're in, you have different tabs. So for example, you have the caps tab here, and the caps is what is referred to as the thing which is on the top and on the bottom of your object. Now, because at the cube we really don't have like a top and bottom side, and every side of the cube is basically a cap, we didn't have this setting at the cube, but here in the cylinder we can define whether we like the cylinder to be closed off or not. And again, on the right here we have the fillet to make the edges on the bottom and top part rounded. And then we have the slice option here, and this is used to kind of slice the cylinder in a certain way or a certain degree. Now, another thing to mention maybe here about the tabs on this one is that you can actually select more than one tab by holding the Shift key, and then you get all the activated tabs in one view here, and that might be a nice little thing if you want to change different things all at once. Yeah, go ahead, check a few of those objects out, see what kind of settings they have, and yeah, but I think the caps, the fillet and the slice are the most used ones when it comes to the parametric objects. Now this is also a quick recap from one of the first sessions. We talked about this in this episode as well. It's just a very key fundamental concept, and that is the change of states between a parametric object and a polygonal object. And just keep in mind to use this button whenever you want to change the state, or use the C button on your keyboard. Now, yeah, very important. Keep that in mind. Now let's see here. Just to make one thing clear here, when comparing parametric versus polygon objects, then the parametric objects basically are helper objects or helper geometry you use in the beginning. It's not really meant to use them to build your objects. You use them and then you will change the object and the appearance on and on in your process. And you always do this in the polygon mode. So you only use the parametric mode to basically set your scene up or set your object up in the way that it helps you the most, and then later on you will go ahead, make it to a polygon object, and then go from there. You can also use the parametric object to block out a scene, for example, or to block out a design of an object. So what does that mean? Blocking out a scene basically would just mean that you, for example, define or use those very simple geometric objects like the cube, for example, to block out a simple layout of a scene. So you don't necessarily focus on doing much details in this kind of environment, but you basically just would define a few, or would add a few simple objects to your scene. So for example, if you want to block out a room, you could go with the sphere as a lamp, then you add some walls, you add a table, etc. With very simple geometry, and then later on add detail after detail. And when it comes to basically the design of an object, you could also go ahead and use the very simple parametric objects you have here at hand to use them and kind of create and draft the basic shape of your objects without caring too much about details. So for example, if we would do some kind of display touch device interface, it probably would be very flat, something like this maybe, and maybe we would go ahead and want to add some buttons to it. So scale that down, make that also very flat, something like this maybe. And yeah, in this way, just a very simple example, you would go ahead and block out the basic concept of your design, and then later on go into the details and make it look more pretty. So you might asking, is there something in between, actually, between the parametric object and the polygon object? It seems maybe that the going from those simple geometric shapes to something complex is a bit far-fetched and looks a bit complicated. And actually I want to say something else about this, seeing this arrow here. So just hold that thought. Another important thing here about changing from parametric to polygonal object is that this is a one-way street. So you cannot go back from a polygon object to a parametric object. So for example, if I have this cube and I make this editable, and let's say I change the top part here a little bit and do something like this, there's no way I can go back to make this a parametric object. So it's, yeah, as I said, it's a one-way street, and as soon as you make it polygonal, you will change the state of this object forever. The other thing I started to talk about is the thing in between here. So it seemed a bit far-fetched to go from one simple cube to maybe something more complex, and we actually have different tools to create our own custom parametric objects, which can have much more detailed or complex shapes than the ones we saw in the parametric tab over in Cinema 4D. So we will cover this in a later episode. In this lecture overall, lecture number 1 or 2, number 2 we are here. Basically, lecture number 2 will have a bit more look into the polygonal side of modeling things, and then later come back to this kind of step and see how we can create our own custom parametric objects, because I think it's quite important to, first of all, get the grasp on how to do polygon modeling, and then we can come back to creating our own custom parametric objects.